Next up, David Cameron. Now, he's U-turned on his criticisms of the cuts to foreign aid. The former Prime Minister says that he's now a realist. Thank goodness for that. It didn't come a moment too soon when it comes to the issue. But he's called for global banks to invest more in developing countries. That is to curb China's influence. So joining me live is the former editor of The Labourist, Peter Edwards, and also GB News contributor and former Brexit MEP Martin Daubney. I'm going to start with you then, Peter. What do you think? China seem to be buying up swathes of Africa, and it looks like, and now I think the rest of the world are getting a bit jittery because Africa has a lot of resources.
Well, David Cameron raised aid spending when in his office, and I think he deserves credit for that, but I'm afraid he's something of a discredited figure now because of his business links and his time in office. I think it's right to flag a concern about China and also Russia basically investing in infrastructure or capital projects in part of Africa so they have an economic way in to what might be a developing or struggling economy, but then try and exert political influence as well. And we know, unfortunately, that the Russian leadership and the Chinese leadership, I'm not talking about the ordinary folk, but the governments don't always play by the rules of the West, particularly around engagement in foreign nations. So I think what China's doing is a source of great concern. I'm not sure David Cameron is the best advocate for this, because what he's really saying is that we need to work closer together with other countries. Well, he had all these bust-ups with the EU before the referendum, and he's saying that essentially global problems need global solutions. And that was exactly what was said by Gordon Brown, and that was correct. And David Cameron spent about 10 years rubbishing that point. So he's woken up to the idea now that global problems do require global solutions.
He's sort of admitting that, though he's not denying that he's gone about, he's changed his mind. But didn't we do this anyway? I mean, didn't the British go in and take things from Africa and other countries and do exactly what the Chinese are doing? So I'm just wondering, it's slightly hypocritical, but what do you think, Martin?
Well, several points. First of all, I'm glad that Cameron's finally sort of smelt the coffee on the fact that charity should begin at home. Conservative voters would love foreign aid to be cut and see more money spent domestically. It's madness that, for example, we're funding the Nigerian space project or sending money to India, the world's fastest growing economy. On the subject of China, they're waking up far too late to this. While the West was asleep at the wheel, China has been busy taking over nations with the resources it needs and liberal Westerners need. Cobalt in Congo, £6 billion worth of infrastructure. So they command the supply of the minerals we need for batteries, for iPhones, for computers. And everyone that complains about that also pays for it by buying devices. On to the issue of slavery. Isn't it funny how Western liberals obsess on the empire and the slavery of old, when right now young boys are digging cobalt out of the ground in Congo just to go into their iPhone or their new Tesla. Everyone that partakes in this funds modern slavery, and they're silent on that. They'd rather bang on about things 300 years ago in Britain while ignoring the problem right now. But as far as China's influence, that horse has bolted.
I found it interesting as well, because when I was reading the piece a while ago in The Guardian with Laura Trevelyan going back to say or talk about repatriations and giving money back to people from the countries that are supposedly her family had taken money from and put slaves in. It just seems a bit ridiculous, really, when she probably sent the messages using her iPhone or whatever it was, and yet people seem to be ignoring that. Do you think that there's a bit of hypocrisy there?
I wouldn't. I think that was Laura Trevelyan, wasn't it?
That was
right?
Laura Trevelyan.
I wouldn't single out her particularly.
No, but there's lots of them that do it. But she did do it, and she did write about it, so I'm pointing her out, because she did.
But I believe she also wrote a cheque, so she's actually... She and her family,
they gave 100 grand, but it's interesting that they should be bothering to do that and be pointing that out when right now, we are all partaking in modern slavery by buying iPhones and all the modern things that we're using right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've never bought an iPhone, but I completely accept we buy lots of things and we don't know about all the details of the supply chain. And I suspect, and I don't buy from Amazon, but if we looked into lots of other products we buy in more detail, we'd probably be horrified about where they all come from. I wouldn't be so dismissive of everyone's motivations as Martin would. I'm on the left, but when I was a student, I spent a lot of time reading things like slave narratives from the Caribbean, from America, and I found them fascinating and absolutely horrifying. So I don't do it out of a kind of London coffee-drinking, hand-drinking approach. I do it because some of the language in those narratives from the 18th and 19th century is seared on my memory. But let's talk about what we can do now. The word reparations I'm concerned about, again, because to anyone who's studied history, that sums up images of the end of the First World War, Germany, hyperinflation and all the terrible things that followed. So I probably wouldn't use the word reparations, but I do think it's right that Britain plays a role in essentially infrastructure investment where it's been guilty of very grievous wrongs in the last 200 or 300 years. But I think that's through partnerships. I don't think that's through writing a cheque particularly.
The trouble with reparations is, like, where will it end? I mean, do we ask for reparations from the ancient Romans? What about the Vikings? What about the Normans? I mean, they invaded, they took the lives of many working class people and forced them into Scotland and Wales. Do we ask them, where does this stop? Reparations is madness because it's a cheque that's blank and never ends. We have to deal with slavery today, where it exists right now. But the Liberals don't want to tackle that because the fact of the matter is it shifts the narrative. The most enslaved people on the earth are in Africa and in China and in Korea, and it's not white people who are those slave owners. So therefore, there's a complete blind spot on the Liberal left side of the argument. It just doesn't fit the script of white man bad. And that's what's happening. It's being completely and utterly swept under the carpet while they sit around on their iPhones tweeting about being virtuous. iPhones that are funded by slavery. Now,
I think Martin's ranting away, and I don't know if that's directed as me as someone who I would describe myself as a Liberal, but, you know, there are things we agree on, for example. So there's a real risk in a supply chain of things like iPhones today. There's a risk of hypocrisy for anyone on the left, and I've said I wouldn't use the word reparations, perhaps for some of the reasons that Martin has laid out. So I think perhaps Martin may have gone into this thinking we were going to be on opposite sides.
I'm not going to pop at you. I'm saying generally speaking.
OK, but I'm a Liberal. I'm on the left, and I do lots of things that are part of that group. And just because someone is from a middle-class background and lives in a city in the West and maybe votes for a Liberal or left-leaning party doesn't automatically mean that they're hypocrites. I think what Martin's saying, and I do agree...
What are you saying? What are you saying?
Well, I think...
What are you saying? What are you saying?
Let's not talk about it as reparations. Let's actually do something about it. So that's not writing a cheque. That's actually investing in countries where there's been great wrong. But as Martin says, let's actually all show a lot more curiosity about where our products come from today. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny example. I'm just one person in the world. I don't buy from Amazon because I'm not comfortable with the level of taxation they pay. But I'm completely realistic that, you know, me spending 10 quid on a book in a British high street is not going to change the world.
OK, fair enough. But let's come back to David Cameron then. Is he being realistic in terms of cutting the foreign aid then? Because he's talking about cutting it. But it sounds like what he's really saying is let's transfer it. Instead of giving it to these countries, let's put it into sort of a big fund where we can then sort of all try and beat China.
Yeah.
And that's what he's saying, isn't he?
He's basically asking for private money buyouts. He's asking banks to loan money to China. So the way that China's been so successful in Africa, it's like saying, we will get the cobalt out of your ground because you haven't got the technology, and we'll give you a share of the take. And it won't cost you anything. But meanwhile, we also soft take over your country without a single shot being fired. The Chinese empire has succeeded beyond the realms of possibility. Cameron wants the banks to offer that money to the African nations to take loans out against future earnings. I think it's for the birds. China are already there. These deals have been sealed.
I think briefly on that, Martin made an interesting point, privatisation. I would want assurance that David Cameron doesn't have any personal economic motivations in that when he's arguing for a bigger role for private banks in state investment.
Yeah, but you don't want any of them to be involved in that. I mean, that seems to be the way where the cookie's crumbling.